For decades, those of us who've lived in this world felt like there was a lot of talk about action, but very little actual action, right? Um, so it's the very recent and the very explosive rise of renewables, solar photovoltaics, wind, and batteries, driven largely by the extraordinary manufacturing capabilities of China that we are here today at this point. And so so energy transition now has been given a new lease of life. A couple of decades ago, we were all talking about things like carbon taxes and all this kind of stuff, and that wasn't going anywhere. We needed a real serious technological breakthrough to move the needle on reducing carbon emissions. Now, the stakes are also high when it comes to transportation. Globally, transport is about a sixth of CO2 emissions, give or take. The stakes in Canada are even higher. I think Canada is about a quarter of our emissions come from transportation. And so electrification of that, especially electrification with renewables, is what is going to take us down the emissions reductions path for transport as well. So in the world of EVs, we found ourselves at a remarkable and a slightly uncomfortable spot right now, right? About a year and a half ago, it felt as though electrification of transport was almost inevitable, right? That the numbers were going up, and it seemed that the transition was well nigh. But today we're facing headwinds. The sector is doing really well across the world, but in Canada, we are seeing a bit of a retrenchment. And lots of reasons for that. First is that the policy landscape in Canada has shifted. We used to have subsidies at the federal level, subsidies at the provincial level for electric vehicle purchases, and those are gone. Importantly, the zero emissions vehicle mandate, that sales mandate that the federal government had, 100% by 2035, that's also on a pause. And so it seems like things are a bit of a holding pattern. Meanwhile, our biggest trading partner has signaled a hostility to electric vehicles and a doubling down on fossil fuels. And so all of this puts us at a very interesting moment because the rest of the world is really moving in the direction of electric vehicles really fast. And Werner is going to show some numbers that should convince you of that. But there's a bit of a hope, a little bit of a glimmer in the headlines. Last week, Mark Carney announced, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, anyway, that 49,000 vehicles from China would be allowed back into the Canadian market at a 6.1% tariff, which is what is afforded to the most favored nations, as opposed to the 106% before that. Right? And is that a game changer? I don't know. Our panelists, experts will tell us about that. But there is, in fact, a change happening. But it is in the context of a country that is locked into a 20th century technology. Right? We are a oil exporting country, something like, don't quote me on it, a quarter of Canadian exports are oil, give or take. We are also that's one side of the nation. The other side is locked into an ICE supply chain, and so switching to electric vehicles in Canada is going to be a challenge. But again, this is an interesting time because there is change everywhere, and maybe it's also then an opportunity. So to help us think through some of these things, our goal today is to think through some of these things, and to help us navigate this challenge, we have two exceptional experts. We'll begin with a short talk from Werner Antweiler, who's a chair in industrial trade policy at the Sauder School of Business. He'll help us understand the economic forces driving EVs around the world and its implications for Canada. Werner will be followed by Megan Lohmann, who is visiting us from northern BC. Is that accurate? Kootenays. Never call it. Okay. Apologies for that. Megan is the CEO of a remarkable organization called the Community Energy Association. She's at the front lines of infrastructure for electrification and knows exactly what happens when federal and provincial laws meet local communities. So we'll start with Werner, then Megan, and then I'll ask them some questions and open it up for a Q&A. Thank you.
Use arrows. Yeah.
How do I switch over to my presentation? Oh, it's already there.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Werner Antweiler, an economics professor at the Sauder School of Business. I actually specialize in a lot of energy and environmental research as well as international trade, and I'm also an empirical researcher, so I really love throwing numbers around, in particular numbers about what's happening in the EV space. These two charts actually show on the left side the share of new car sales for EVs across countries, and on the right side, the actual share of the total stock. Of course, these numbers are always smaller than on the left side. And as you may have heard, Norway is kind of racing ahead faster than anybody else. 9 out of 10 cars that are sold there are EVs. But if you go down that list, you actually see China not far behind. Like roughly every second car that's being sold in China is electric as well. And that is a much larger market. And so now China is really dominating the production of electric vehicles. And that is a game changer because scale matters when it comes to producing cars. And if you look down where you can find Canada, it's actually below the average for Europe. We're not doing terrible, but we're definitely not right at the top either. So way to go here for Canada in terms of catching up to the other side. But the Nordic countries are kind of, as you see, pretty much at the top, and as well as China. So the next slide is really the most important one. And that's showing you the cost of batteries that go into electric vehicles. And that is a fundamental game changer for the industry. And that's going to continue, policy or not. That's going to drive EV uptake all by itself, even if there's no policy at all, because once EVs are cheaper than the comparable internal combustion engine vehicle, people want to buy it because it's cheaper and maybe better too in some ways. And then the question is, what is holding it back? Sometimes practical problems like charging infrastructure. There's also a little bit of range anxiety in some places, especially where people drive longer distances, but not in places like Europe, where people tend to drive much shorter distances. So a lot of regional variation we see in the data already. But this cost has come down so much. It's now sort of reached a point where it's roughly around $100 per kilowatt hour for a battery pack. And that's a magic point that a lot of experts thought that's where we almost reach purchasing parity for the cost of the car. Now, if you look at the life cycle cost of the car, driving electric is actually already cheaper, much cheaper than putting gasoline in your tank. Here in BC, you pay only about a quarter for the same kilometer cost when you drive electric rather than using gasoline. So on a life cycle basis, many EVs are already cheaper, but when it comes to the purchase price, there's still a gap in many instances, but that is rapidly shrinking as well. Here's a story from Germany. I grew up in Germany. People are car crazy in Germany. The running joke is people get the membership in the automobile club as a birth certificate. But essentially, Germany is a story where they had various policies that were expiring at certain points, and you see these big spikes there in the data. That's when the policy ended, and people were rushing to get their EV before the policy expired. And then at the end of 24, they cut them all. So like Canada, they basically ran out of money, saying, well, sorry, our budgets are empty. People were on their own buying cars. But look at what happened afterwards, a recovery. So now at the end of 25, the market is pretty much where it was at the end of 24, 23 when the subsidies were cut. And that is driven by the market. It's not driven by subsidies anymore. Now, I think that's telling us here in Canada stories that even though we have seen policies change, but I think the trajectory is pretty clear towards EV. This is Germany as well, where we see the now arrival of new entrants into the market from China. The companies such as BYD, Polestar, Leapmotor, GWM's Great Wall Motors, and others, and Chery. So you can see they are actually getting into the market, even with the countervailing duties, that the European Union has put into place. SIEC actually has somewhat larger countervailing duties than some of the others. So things are happening even with these duties. And so that tells you something about what will happen here in Canada. I think we're going to see the same effect here as well. What our picture in Canada looks like is shown in this chart. The darker bars are the battery electric vehicles, and the lighter blue bars on top, these are the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. If you stack them together, you see by the end of last year, we got to almost that's over 18% uptake. So new car sales across all of Canada. That looks like it's maybe not all that high, but when you look at it closer as to where things happened during 24, you see it was all driven essentially by two provinces, Quebec and BC, because we had the most generous support infrastructure. And so Quebec was racing ahead. Every third car was already being sold as electric, a little less here in BC. And even in BC, there's a lot of variation across different places, urban versus rural. So very different uptake across all of Canada. Not much uptake in a place. Actually, Alberta wasn't reporting at all in that data set. They don't show their data. Okay, one more chart for just BC to give you an idea. Even though here in BC in early 25, the policies expired, first the carbon pricing and then the EV rebates from both the province and the federal government. It has certainly dampened the sales, but not like crazy. The effect was much stronger in Quebec, where the incentives were more generous. Here in BC, people have momentum in buying EVs, and that is driving what we see. Just a quick word on the zero emission vehicle mandate. It's under review. Some people politically have argued that it may have been too far too soon for some. We can debate that maybe today too. But will this mandate be gone? Will it be reformed? Will something else replace it? Again, that is a big policy question that's looming. How can governments actually finance incentives? Because in the end, you cannot possibly finance a purchase of every new car in Canada. It's like that no government anywhere can afford that, maybe except Norway, because they had money to spend. But here in Canada, I think we have other budgetary pressures that will make it extremely difficult to keep on subsidizing without actually getting some revenue stream. Originally, here in BC, we got some revenue from the carbon tax that was recycled into things like EV infrastructure, at least a small part of it. But governments are definitely very tight. The last slide I want to show here is the difference between urban and rural uptake. And that's the other story about EV uptake. It depends on infrastructure and driving behavior. And these are all the postal code areas, the first two letters of the postal code that show you on the lower axis, a horizontal axis, the population density of those areas, and then on the vertical axis, the percentage share of EVs on a sort of double logarithmic scale. And you can clearly see there is some correlation here between population density and EV share. The more urban you get, the higher the uptake. And that means people in urban areas feel a lot more comfortable driving electric, maybe because the distances are shorter, maybe because the infrastructure for charging is better. In any case, we need to understand why this gap persists. Now, what would actually it take for people in rural areas to also embrace electrification? And I think with that, these are enough numbers to get started into our discussion. Thank you.
Well, that was a perfect segue. I'll tell you what's happening in rural. And I also won't use numbers to do it. So there we go. We're well balanced. Thanks for having me. Really quickly, Community Energy Association, we're a charitable nonprofit. We work across Canada, mostly in the West though, and have a diversified team of 50 people that work on retrofits and policy, convening around anything energy and climate, and importantly, translating policy to on-ground action. I hail from the southeast corner of BC, Fernie, British Columbia, and that's the Ktunaxa territory. Really happy back in 2017-18 to have helped Ktunaxa install 132 solar panels on their government building, which was directly tied into a level 2 charger, which was one of the first Indigenous-led integrated systems. Well, I think it was the first in Canada, actually. So our organization, one of the areas that we work in is electric mobility. The map that I'm showing here are all of the network infrastructure that we have installed since 2017. You'll notice that most of it is in rural areas, connecting some key urban centers. So the story that I'll sort of tell today is around that rural connectivity. It's about introducing technology opportunities for participating in an energy transition in areas that have low capacity, less access to training and education around these pieces, and not much market share, as Werner has aptly pointed out. So when we started our work in this area, Lower Mainland was where the vehicles were. In the Kootenays, which is the darker blue segment right in the middle, we had 11 registered EVs, including plug-in hybrids. Despite that, the 40 local governments in the region said, that's fine, we're not building this for those 11 people. We want to be part of the transition, and in order to do that, we're going to develop a community-led EV charging infrastructure project. So we helped them secure the funding, secure the partnerships, do the procurement. We got 13 DC fast chargers and 46 level 2s installed over 3 years. All of them owned and operated, all the fast chargers owned and operated by utilities, so BC Hydro and Fortis. And it marked the first fast charging infrastructure outside of the Lower Mainland in British Columbia. The success of that network led to local governments over in the southeast corner of Alberta contacting one of the mayors and saying, how the heck did you do that? We want to capture the tourists that are trying to come into southern Alberta from the Lower Mainland in their EVs. We need to be connected. Importantly, the driver there was not climate. It was economic development, and it was tourism opportunity. So in the Kootenays, certainly the local governments were driven by the Climate Action Charter here in BC in 2008 that required that every local government have a climate action plan. We identified that transportation accounted for 60 to 75% of emissions at the community level, drastically higher than in urban centers where you have transit and other mobility options. The distances in rural areas necessitate vehicle use to a greater degree. Services are centralized, and so emissions associated with transportation is much higher. That was not the primary motivator in Alberta. The motivator was economic development. So it only took us 2 years to build, design, fund, and get ownership of the network that would connect Calgary south to the US border and over to the Bow Valley and Canmore, which then led to the north asking the same, help us do a network. This is now under construction, the first site at Enoch Cree Nation, another Indigenous partnership. And it's connecting Edmonton south and west. The stars across northern BC are level 2 infrastructure, and that is intentional to complement the fast charging network that BC Hydro has now stepped in to install across that region. We're now going east, Edmonton east. That is going into an expression of interest in a few weeks here to get a owner-operator, and we've helped southern Alberta as well connect along the corridor from sort of London up to Tobermory, a similar rural context. So the story here really, is that public investment, federal, provincial incentives were necessary to get the foundational base of EV infrastructure across these rural areas. Now, I would not recommend that any local government invest in this infrastructure because private sector has now come in. We now have in all of these communities or in all these regions, investments from Petrocan, Shell, On the Run. There are multiple private sector owner-operators that are now taking the risk and the cost. But establishing that shift toward that market transformation necessitated some of that public funding and coordination. So similar to the growth of EVs in Canada, the growth of infrastructure has also increased. Of course, there's been ongoing investment from the federal government and here in BC from provincial government on charging infrastructure. That has actually continued. There was another intake just a few weeks ago. for infrastructure in rural areas across Canada. Pretty unique from the situation with the vehicles, where that was a sudden stop, but had uncertainty, which has led to the decline in EV adoption as a contributing factor. Had it been a hard stop with no, concept that it may return, I don't think we would have seen such a steep drop off. But when people think that something might come back, their tendency to wait is higher. So that's kind of the infrastructure technical side of things. From an education and awareness, Werner mentioned this as well, the perceived range anxiety, in some cases very real. But alongside the deployment of the networks, what we try to do is also blend that with real life experiential learning and demonstration case studies. This is Greg Hill. If you're a big skier, you might know him as an influencer in the ski industry. He's committed to 100% low carbon adventuring, and so lives in Revelstoke. This is one of our Accelerate Kootenays stations that was put in up at Rogers Pass. At Rogers Pass, the site adjacent to this station is where a gas station used to be, when the range of gas vehicles did not enable you to drive the distance between Golden and Revelstoke and necessitated a gas station at the top. So that's where we've come on the, gas-fueled vehicle side of things. I don't believe we will need this station here forever. It's good redundancy. There's a lot of closures if you've ever driven Rogers Pass. But it was just an interesting link of the story to the transition of transportation generally. In Southern Alberta, it was about leaning into the vibe of these vast spaces. And again, the distance between, let's say, Lethbridge and Calgary necessitates, at this point, charging infrastructure to be there. This is a -30 day. I drove from Fernie to Lethbridge and arrived with like 1% battery. It was a bit harrowing because the network wasn't in yet. So a little self-serving, I gotta say. We also, with local governments, try to tie in the vision. So this is Sparwood. In the background is one of the mines, the metallurgical coal mines in the Elk Valley. They installed solar on their district, their city hall essentially. And TAC partnered with us on the installation of this particular station. And the idea here is to tie in the link of industry, of metallurgical coal being an essential steelmaking element, feeding into electric vehicles, while also capturing a natural and renewable resource in the background. We tell a lot of stories about the adventures that are possible in rural areas with EVs. So this is Andrew Tudor. He lives in Nelson and was one of the first Leaf owners in British Columbia. He used to have to, between Nelson and Kelowna, camp at a plug-in at a campground. It would take him like 12 hours to drive a 4 or 5 hour trip, but he would do it and he was committed. He now has a Rivian and is a big ambassador in the region. But again, it was about demonstrating that it's possible to drive electric in these rural contexts. We partnered on an initiative to kind of further this story of energy transition and creative solutions to areas that were not connected to or didn't have access to EV infrastructure. This is Fernie Alpine Resort. That's my little car. We have an 80 kilowatt battery that is on a trailer that we bring to events. It has the capability to charge vehicles. It can take food trucks off of diesel for the duration of a market or what have you. This has now become a community asset and again allows us to demonstrate the possibility of renewables. Last little example I'll give is on the medium duty, heavy duty side of things. We just completed 4 stops across BC in Victoria, Burnaby, Kamloops, and Prince George, showcasing where we've come in the industry in British Columbia around medium duty, heavy duty vehicles. This was an NRCan and Province of BC funded initiative. And again, allowed for hands-on exposure to all of the, this is in BC. And these folks drove around with us and showcased all sorts of innovative new technologies. If you visit this website, you can see our webpage. It's called Fleet Forward is the initiative, and tons of videos and other resources that really highlight the state of medium duty, heavy duty in this province. I will say we're not talking about long haul trucks at this point in the province or the country. Where this works really well is last mile delivery services where we can have predictable routes. This is the fire truck in Victoria. It's a pretty cool one on display. And last little piece on capacity building, I just want to shout out to BCIT and the other post-secondary colleges that have started to integrate electric vehicle technology training into their programs. This is a really essential element that doesn't get a lot of attention, is the ability for us to actually maintain and manage these fleets as they become a little bit more pervasive. And this is my daughter and I in Newfoundland charging up. We took a road trip with an EV, and it was actually super easy. So thank you.
Thanks so much. So for those of you online, we're going to get the panelists to cozy up with their chairs, and we will move the camera in a second, but we will move to some questions. Milind is going to start out with a few questions. We are going to put in the chat the Slido link, so you can start thinking about your own questions and put them in there. And if you're in the room, we're also using Slido. If you didn't connect earlier, it's just written on the board over there, the code. And I will also be able to submit questions for you if you don't have a device and you're in the room. So with that, we'll let you start. And if you're online, just it'll be a second while we adjust the camera. Go ahead. Oh yeah, you do need mics.
I want to start with subsidies. Now the EV subsidies are coming, but I heard rumors from someone who Transport Canada that they're trying to creep them back. So first question is, were they needed to start with? Were they just transfers to wealthy people, or did they actually serve a function in the diffusion of EVs? And secondly, should they come back, and in what form? In the form of support to supply chains, for instance, or infrastructure? What do you think about all of that?
Well, if I look at other jurisdictions, subsidies are always popular, and I think there is a good chance that some of them may come back if there's money. I think the big question is there enough money to go around to bring them back, maybe on a smaller scale or more targeted. I should explain that the subsidies that existed in British Columbia and at the federal level were already targeting different ways. The federal subsidies had a cap on the eligibility for the resale price of a motor vehicle. So the most expensive vehicles were not getting subsidized. And the number shifted. I think they were like 55,000 plus trim that would bring it up to a higher price. But essentially, the most expensive cars are not subsidized because there's actually strong evidence from research that has shown that these people who buy those EVs, that would have bought them anyhow, they can afford them. It makes no difference to them. So the targeting has been focusing more on the vehicles that are more price sensitive, where people spend more time thinking about which vehicle they buy because of the price. And here in British Columbia, the British government went a step further and focused on the income of households. So targeting the incentives only to households that are the lowest threshold, paid out between $80,000 and $100,000, plus there was also a cap on the eligibility as well. So there's the focusing of the incentives that really matters, because then you can spend the money where it matters the most, and really identifying the sweet spot where it actually changes the decision from moving away from an internal combustion engine vehicle to an electric vehicle. That's really where our government still needs to figure out how can we spend the money in the smartest way and avoid actually falling into that trap of subsidizing everything we cannot afford. And then we have some force and backing policies. So the key question is, can we design a policy that is also enduring, that is not going to change, and where we see the effect of the data, where as soon as there's any worry about the subsidy comes to an end, everybody's rushing, then it's a drop off a cliff. The auto industry certainly doesn't like that. It makes it really hard to plan. You don't know what's going to happen next year. It's bad for investment. You need a stable environment for a regime that is durable and that's targeted. You also asked about subsidies for the plants and for building EV plants or
battery plants. Now, to the extent that they have been very costly, the billions of dollars, and there's really a good question whether or not that's actually delivering value. To some extent, it looks like a subsidy to the car makers and to specific car makers. It's not a level playing field where subsidies are essentially going towards a technology or a solution. It's basically, you pick your winners, somebody builds a plan, and what politicians like about it is they get the job out of it. And they can say, well, we've done that, there's a red ribbon cutting event, and so they get the political knowledge of it, but not necessarily the economic knowledge. So I'm a bit skeptical about the value of these investments because they seem to be more driven by short-term political thinking rather than sound economic investments into innovations in the future. Whether or not these plans will survive remains to be seen. Even with the subsidies, some actually have already not gone ahead, even with the money that is being offered, simply because the market isn't there. Ultimately, the market drives those decisions.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just in case there's government listening, I would also advocate for incentives applied to used vehicles. We have now a good, relatively good market share here in British Columbia of new purchases, and as a result, that people will change technology every 3 to 5 years, or even shorter with their phones. It's not dissimilar in the EV world as well, and so we do have some dealers that are actively promoting that. In fact, the one dedicated used dealership in the West that I know of is who exclusively EVs is actually in Calgary, go electric, and it's able to keep a good stock. But yeah, if in BC, that could be an element that we have for the affordability piece. And then on the infrastructure, we've seen an attempt by the federal government to map out and identify what they're calling kind of red zones across the country that have poor connectivity. They still don't fully reflect the secondary roads and the highways that connect our urban centers. They still tend to preference the nodes, like the core nodes between. And so again, that flexibility for us to be able to identify well-traveled rural routes that may have economic and tourism co-benefits that aren't reflected in just a simple data-based mapping exercise.
You did mention the private actors are coming in to making the infrastructure investment. So my next question for both of you is, how is that playing out? Because the thing that we keep hearing is there's this thing called range anxiety, especially in rural areas, and the best investment one can make is actually in the infrastructure, because the price of vehicles is coming down, and there's a potential for some kind of maybe a market failure on the infrastructure side.
Yeah, I think if you look at purchase incentives and money that the government can spend on any of these different areas, there's a question: how much money to plans, how much money to the purchase of these, and how much money towards infrastructure. And there's a really good argument to be made that it's really the infrastructure that actually has the biggest bottleneck. Because if people don't feel comfortable about the charging environment, if it's not convenient, if it's cumbersome, you get to a charger and it's broken. If you think about traveling somewhere and there's this big gap in the journey for my trip, that's basically what's holding back people from making that switch. And I think given that resources are scarce for governments, it's increasingly important to focus on the infrastructure and make that a priority, because that is essentially a classic chicken and egg problem, where if there's not enough charging infrastructure, it really is something that people will feel is holding them back. And where we see charging infrastructure lacking is both in the private and the public domain. In the public domain, along highways and major routes that people are traveling on, as well, of course, in places of convenience that we travel to, from the supermarket to the cinema to whatever you think of mall. And also increasingly we see the problems in urban environments where people rent and don't have their own parking space, where people live in a strata complex, and it's a strata council making decisions about whether or not there's infrastructure, and where people have only curbside parking, even when they have their own home. If you don't have a dedicated parking spot in front of your house, you can't really install a charger. And so these infrastructure deficits are very significant. And how to overcome them requires not just money, but also smart solutions, some regulatory changes, some behavioral changes, experience, people learning how to charge in different places. Just raising the comfort level that will hold back people from making that switch if they feel charging isn't convenient or too expensive of the content. Thank you.
Yeah, yes. It is very expensive to install, own, and operate DC fast charging equipment. And so the payback is too long for private sector to be the innovator in these spaces and in particularly areas with or low usage. So you will not get a private investor in a area where there's 11 cars because you will never get the usage that you need, the volume, in order to make that a reasonable business case. So when we were looking at, the Kootenays and Southern Alberta, we were looking at maybe starting to make money in the 5 to 7 year timeline, with significant upfront capital cost and a huge amount of risk if in those early years the incentives had dropped off like that year, that it would have been a disaster, right? So once that base network was established and EVs were being adopted and tourism was starting to pull more in, then the usage became, a reasonable amount that then, yes, you could start to increase the volume of infrastructure. But when we're looking at, northern BC, northern Alberta, an installed station, if that's, $150,000, $200,000, and then annually the demand charges for the energy use each time someone plugs in, you get the demand charge hit. And if you get no other users that month, you may be paying like $200, $300 for demand charges. And that's like untenable for the business case. Yeah. So that is, I think, again, where we need to be smart about where public money is invested, in terms of establishing that base network that enables increased usage to then more private sector dollars. Yeah.
So is public money actually going in to some of these charging? What governments are investing under what programs and so on?
Yeah, so NRCan, like right now, the infrastructure that we're deploying in the northeast of Alberta is NRCan funded from previous intake, and they just closed another one with an exclusive focus on rural areas. But they're identified red nodes, right? I think it doesn't capture all the opportunity, but
I should mention also here in British Columbia, BC Hydroactive was providing incentives for residential buildings, including strata buildings. There was significant uptake in the program. At some point, they had to cap actually access to the program because we were running out of funding. But these programs are also very important because what I have learned from some of my own research is that convenience of charging is really paramount for a lot of people. And the easiest you can think of about charging is you get home, you park your car, you plug in, you forget about it, and the next morning it's charged. And so the convenience, it really only happens in 2 places: at home, where your car sits most of the time, or if you commute to work and your car sits for 6, 7, 8 hours at the same place at a place of work, there's also an opportunity for convenient charging. In fact, like I'm working with UBC Park, I'll figure out solutions here for UBC parkades going forward. What's the right mix of chargers? How do we have to structure the access to make it really convenient and lower the obstacles to making that work? But it's really overcoming those hurdles is not just money. For the stratas, here the province also brought in regulation that lowers the threshold for the bylaws of a strata to be amended. Usually when you amend bylaws of a strata, you need a 3/4 majority. And in some cases that's hard to read when you have only a few EV adopters in strata, and the other people in the strata, oh, we really care. It's not our thing right now. We're not going to do that. And you would have had a hard time getting to a majority. Now, a 50% majority is sufficient to change the bylaws. Plus, the province has instituted mandated EV readiness report. All drivers are required to complete by the end of this year. And that I think can be quite helpful identifying the resource. You mentioned the demand charges. So when you actually use an EV charger, you draw energy, you pay by the kilowatt hour, but you also have demand charges where you pay by the kilowatt, the peak demand that you have at any given time. And so there are different costs that also play into what is a solution that actually works for a particular a vendor who's establishing their own charging station, or a strata or a rental building that's setting up charging. They have to worry about how much they will pay in the end, and how to balance it in the right way to keep it affordable.
There's a question here from the audience which has many thumbs ups. So this one says, why is there no investment in bicycles, industry, and transit electrification in places? Why the focus on private car ownership? So this is a question about micromobility, and it seems like, well, I ride my bike up and down the hill every day. There are people zipping by me all the time. And so it seems like that's actually inspiring a lot of people to use electric mobility, yet there seem to be some challenges there in terms of inspiring people as well as keeping things safe. So any reactions that
Yeah, actually, I love that question, because the micromobility is also I hope the micromobility is actually part of the solution and changing transportation modes, because the car is a problem in many other ways. Even if you electrify all the cars, we still have issues with accidents, we have issues with congestion, we have all kinds of issues with other problems with cars. And so moving towards solutions that are better in different dimensions is really important. That means building public transit. I have a big champion of building this SkyTrain all the way out to UBC. I hope it will happen sooner rather than later. But also micromobility. That means e-bikes, e-scooters, where people now find they can go longer distances, they feel more comfortable actually riding on those. It's not so challenging going up the hill to UBC when you have an e-bike compared to an ordinary bike. And so that can be and needs to be part of the solution as well. And they're getting well, affordable for many, that they may think that an e-bike is a really nice complement to have to actually use for shorter trips. And you're not stuck in traffic and not stuck in congestion. I have an e-bike too. I love it. It seems to be really fun to get around. And I think that's a really important part of the solution.
I'll just give a quick example. So the province of BC, and I don't today know if it's available, but have had fleet electrification incentive programs, and I'm quite certain it's still alive, but that has been available to private sector, public sector fleets, and down to like Zambonis, forklifts. Like, it's been a really well subscribed program. The little fleet that I love the story about is in my valley, Tech, now Up Valley Coal, converted their miner shuttles, so the transportation system that they've got in the community, 12 buses to electric under that program. Not only has it cut, obviously, the greenhouse gas emissions, but it has cut their maintenance costs like substantially. They used to have to run diesel buses in cold weather to maintain, functionality. It was a really cool opportunity to send the mechanics down to get trained. It was in California that they were sent, get trained on these buses, and now you've got a fleet that can be charged up between shifts of the miners. You've got zero fuel being consumed, and the maintenance of the buses is like 60 to 70% less. And you'll hear that if you watch the video about Victoria, the fire truck. Same story in terms of the savings on the maintenance side.
There's a question here for you, Megan. Do you experience that rural resistance to EVs is primarily grounded in a lack of sense creativity, meaning just trying to imagine doing things, or is it more ideological?
it depends. I hate to say that. I've run into both. I've run into the really rough guy that pulled up to a charging station in a big F-150 beside me, and he had a big F Trudeau sticker on his truck, and I was like, oh boy, this is gonna be an interesting conversation. It's like, as if I'll give 1 cent of carbon tax to that guy, like I'm driving this thing, so and I didn't want to get into like you're plugging into it, like whatever. But that was his motivation. It was actually like the opposite ideological motivation that I expected, which was really interesting. It's a little bit of both. I find that this is why we've pushed so hard on experiential learning opportunity, especially in rural areas and in cold climates. If you can get someone into an EV and have them experience the acceleration, the speed, the comfort, the quiet, suddenly like all of the criticisms around, well, I'll just run out of battery when I go up the hill, or well, that experiential learning I think is key. Of course, not everyone can have access to that. But that is why we put so much effort into, okay, let's get into community, let's actually get the infrastructure visible so that now when you're driving, walking around, you notice that there's an EV charger, right? Interesting in the Alberta context, because that's where I think it's most visible, the political conversation around electric vehicles. Well, I mean, it's just not happening, and it's like a very clear message from the government. Despite that, these local governments are coordinating, planning, helping to fund and set up the infrastructure networks that we're working on. Again, because it's a good economic opportunity and it's a good tourism diversification opportunity. So despite that narrative being pretty anti-EV in that province and from government, I think there are so many other co-benefits and just opportunities for communities to embrace the technology that frankly the whole world is shifting toward, right? And they want to be part of it when it gets down to the local level. Yeah.
Let me come back to the winter myth. I think that's an interesting question where people actually talk about, oh, EVs have these significant problems where you basically you can't run in the winter because the batteries don't work or you drain the battery too fast. Obviously, when you're operating an EV in the winter, it's not only providing propulsion, but it's also providing heating, which otherwise when you drive an internal combustion engine, you get sort of free because it's a waste heat from the engine. The reason why driving electric is so much cheaper is that it's so much more efficient. Virtually all of the power gets converted into propulsion. And as when you burn gasoline, you only use about a third of the energy that's stored in the gasoline for propulsion. The rest is just waste heat, right? And so, do you need more electricity in the winter? Yes, because you run the heater. Right? The other thing is that people say, well, batteries they don't work in the winter. Well, in the most extreme climate, you have the same problem for internal combustion engines. You have rock heaters, right? So you know, like your engine won't start until you plug it in and heat it up. And so today's electric vehicles are not necessarily designed specifically for the climates. That's true. But it's hard to actually make those changes by either providing that insulation for components or also running kind of a heat actually, where you plug it in while it's parked overnight. So there are solutions. And they will evolve as the market grows. Right now, the manufacturers focus on the most profitable segment of the market, which are not extreme climates. And so it may take a little longer to get EVs ready for all kinds of different environments that they face challenges.
I will say my favorite part about owning an EV in a winter town is when it's -30 and all my neighbors are plugging in block heaters and they're like trying to get their truck started, and I'm just like, whoop. Like there's no problem. I just press the button and then I drive away and I'm heated within 60 seconds as well, because it's like the fastest and hottest heat. So that is, I mean, my range drops drastically, right? Like that is not a lie. Like that happens. And I therefore have to plan my trips a little differently. That is a negative, I guess. However, it's a mind shift as well, I found.
I'm going to switch to a bit of a macro picture for a second here. So we keep hearing about the critical minerals as the backbone of Canada's post-fossil future. So, but my understanding is that we really are a second world producer for most of these things. We are not like fifth or sixth for copper. We claim to have lots of lithium, but actually we don't have that much in terms of processing. I think we're nickel, maybe we're in the top few, but for most of these things we are not. And yet it seems to me that it's just a big part of the discourse. And so the question is, what should the strategy be? I mean, there's three things. One is actually doing the mining. Then there's the refining, which just seems to be all being done in China and other places. And then there's the actual high value proposition, which is the production of the goods that eventually get sold, the batteries and so on. And so just trying to then understand in this fluid changing landscape, how should we think about this, critical minerals as a Canadian play?
Yeah, critical minerals are important because EVs in the current technology rely on chemistry that involves lithium as well as nickel, manganese, and cobalt. Now, there are alternatives. And so when we talk about what are the critical minerals, we cannot extrapolate from today's technology alone. We have to look at how the chemistry of batteries may evolve and also bring in maybe cheaper materials. If there is a shortage of nickel and manganese and cobalt, the prices will go up, and that would make alternatives more attractive. In China, many batteries that are produced are already using a different chemistry, lithium, iron, and phosphate, and those materials are a lot cheaper and they're not really critical. And so when we talk about critical minerals, that is mostly from the perspective of certain elements that are used, say, for motors, the rare earth elements that are used, and a few others as well, where there is the risk of a monopolization of the market. And monopoly is always problematic in any context, whether it's where one country has a monopoly or where a producer has a monopoly. And we're trying to move away from the situation where we are beholden to monopolistic power from whatever quarter it's coming from. And so when I hear Canadian politicians say, well, we have to own the supply chain and have more value added, it's kind of hard to do because there are economies of scale, especially when it comes to the battery assembly, where China is way ahead because of the size of the market. Also, they have already invested in the refining infrastructure and pivoting away from this and building up infrastructure elsewhere in the world is a costly proposition. It's more costly because we have very high standards for how to do this in our locations, and it won't happen either quickly, nor is there a guaranteed market in 10 or 15 years from now. The chemistry has changed, whether the demand is somewhere else than we thought it is today. So there are a lot of moving parameters in all of this. Plus, if we think about converting all the cars in the world to electric vehicles, how much more nickel, how much more manganese, and how much more cobalt would we need? That could be a big problem. The price would go way up. So we cannot stay on this technology, and we need to find better, smarter solutions for battery technology. That's happening. So the next generation of batteries is already on the horizon, so-called solid-state batteries. They use different chemistry. In addition to lithium iron phosphate, there's lithium sulfur, and there are other solutions that are all in the works. And they come, and we will get there. And that will make batteries even cheaper than today, and maybe also safer, and maybe less dependent on critical minerals.
I'd really like to see investment and support for more battery recycling facilities in Canada. And we have one facility in Trail that can handle the deconstruction and careful handling of the components of battery, but it's the only one in Canada right now. And there were a couple of battery plants that had intended to have a recycling component to it that I believe are now unfunded, like they've pulled out in Ontario, Quebec. This I think is a huge opportunity as well. There's a lot of discussion around second life for batteries that are no longer suitable for use as vehicle batteries, but for residential solar storage, for example, there are different applications. So I think considering what we're going to have in our cycle here in Canada in terms of end of life for vehicle application, we need to figure that out because we will have vehicles that are starting to retire, if not already. And that I think is an opportunity for Canada to lead in as well.
I'm going to switch to the folks online, and here's a question about medium duty adoption. Have you looked at medium duty adoption in places like Norway and China, and is there anything driving adoption that's different than passenger cars we should do here? Is there anything?
I don't have specific data on that breakdown. Having said that, in Norway, obviously the overall adoption is so high. They've invested in the infrastructure, they've invested in the incentives required. I think those are contexts that are quite different. We are a very dispersed country. I think focusing on our opportunity here in terms of the last mile delivery services and return to base routes is our biggest opportunity right now. And we are seeing lots of growth and investment in that in this province. But when we're talking like nationwide, I don't see it on the short horizon.
How different market segments actually play out, where we see light duty vehicles towards heavy duty vehicles. Electrification mobility has some limitations. We see it in trucks now in some places. The heavier the vehicle and the larger the distance, the more problematic is it to switch to batteries. And so we can also look at other forms of hybridization, fuel switching and other solutions that may actually be more economical. And we can push industries to become unaffordable compared to competitors who will push them out of the market. So we have to be very mindful that there is a low-hanging fruit of electrification mobility. That's mostly passenger vehicles. And if you're moving outside that market, it gets more complicated and more problematic. And so we have to maybe travel more slowly in bringing about transition here and takes the signal from the market.
Another question around minerals and mining, because that seems to be a big part of the Greater Canada response that we've been seeing. And so, I evangelize about electric vehicles and batteries and solar PV in all my classes. I go and give guest lectures, and there's always invariably a student or two in the audience who's like, what is this guy talking about? All this mining is bad. It's bad for the local communities. It's bad for Indigenous communities. This is just more, capitalist blabbing. Like, say that those words, but I can see it in their faces. And so, what should my response be to that question? Obviously, mining has been challenging for local communities. We haven't actually done the kinds of mining that we claim to do often. And so how should one think about this question of needing all of this stuff, these minerals and metals, to replace fossil fuels, yet there may be some consequences in the other direction?
Sometimes it's referred to as a green on green conflict. You're trying to solve one problem, climate change, and then you're creating another environmental problem in another sector. There's new types of emissions, local pollutants, and you basically it does have substituted crops. Now we have to be very mindful of that. And one of the problems we have in policy design is that there's often a single focus on one policy outcome. When I think as an environmental economist about emissions, I think about all emissions, and they all have essentially social cost. There's a social cost of carbon, that's a big one. And there's a social cost of nitrogen oxide, and a social cost of particulate matter, but we don't price it. And so we don't take them into account as we should. And that is a problem in policy design, because if you don't do that, and it put a price of zero on emissions from sulfur dioxide or particulate matter or for runoff on pollutants in waters, you end up with a policy that creates new problems. So we need a holistic approach to designing environmental policy in this domain that actually looks at all the emissions everywhere on the planet. Because carbon dioxide is a global pollutant. Well, if we put a price in one place, well, it has a global effect. But if we end up exporting our environmental problems, that we are buying EVs here in Canada, and then the pollution happens in, say, Indonesia or in New Caledonia, then we're exporting our environmental problems. And so we need to figure out a way of accounting that makes sure that we design policies that are holistically taking into account all the negative effects everywhere on the planet. And that's a responsibility we have here in Canada towards all the other countries that we're trading with, because we can't just go on and export our environmental problems to other countries.
I hesitate even saying anything because this is not my area of expertise, and also my opinion has changed. Because I agree. I think we're in a moment where we are reaping the vulnerability of not having control our own destiny in Canada in terms of investing in the economic opportunities. And I just spent 5 days last week in Prince George at the Natural Resources Forum. It's a massive 1,800-person conference that brings together mining, forestry, oil and gas, renewables, and we spent 5 days talking about the opportunity of Canada and specifically Northern BC as an economic driver and participant in energy transition. And the number of times that position was kind of framed as our moment in the context of global change we're seeing in our neighbors to the south and in, Carney's influential speech in Davos, right? It all influenced the conversation last week to the extent where I was like, if not us, then someone else, and will we be able to control the benefits of that for the communities, the involvement of Indigenous communities, and the environmental and social impacts. So I've done a lot of soul searching around this topic as well, because I drive an EV, and use an iPhone. We're all consumers of these goods that have global impact, and so do we want to be more participants of that value chain and control the outcomes of it? I think so. And having seen the depth of involvement in the north here, where we have copper mining, like active, that are, 4 of the major projects are in northern BC. So having seen the level of involvement of local community and Indigenous community, I'm not saying it's perfect or the best solution, but it's perhaps better to know what's happening in our own backyard than not.
Well, plus also there's the impact of the fossil fuels that are being displaced. The local impacts, not just the global impacts. We don't necessarily think about those, but those are also substantial for communities where those fossil fuels are being mined. A question here about, it's an interesting one. What's your sense of public support for purchasing Chinese EV models and or for manufacturing those vehicles in Canada?
I'll just from the public perception narrative, I'm seeing a lot of support. And especially when we clarify that this is not Chinese vehicles being imported, as Chinese manufactured, we won't see a huge shift like Tesla, Volvo, these are vehicles manufactured in China that will land in our communities. Little nuance around the affordability piece as well, the $35,000 per vehicle, 50% of them, $35,000 by 2030 is landed price, not MSRP. So we also need to accept that we may not see the cheapest vehicles, but generally 49,000 vehicles in the context of the Canadian vehicle sales annually is not huge. And I think it just provides more option. And the narrative that I'm seeing, if that's the question, is generally positive among I mean, I'm biased because a lot of my circles are the EV networks across every province in BC, so, or sorry, in Canada.
I should point out in 2024, there were about 200,000 EVs sold in Canada. And so 50,000 would be just about a quarter of that market. And when it comes to the vehicles that could be imported from China right now, if you go back to before the tariffs, the vehicles we were importing from China were the likes of Tesla and Polestar and Volvo primarily. And so they will be coming back. So they were reshuffling production. So they were sending now the vehicles manufactured elsewhere in Canada. Like Tesla was shipping them from the United States rather than from China. And Volvo was shipping them from Belgium rather than from China. So that reshuffling will take place again, and that actually lowers transportation costs. So this is not going to actually resort the industry, and it's just basically getting us back to where we were about 2 years ago. Now, what about the new manufacturers? So BYD and Great Wall Motors and Chery and others, they're making inroads in markets around the world. I was just looking at Brazil, in fact, where they have established a presence. They're building the dealership network, but it takes time, it takes effort to convince people to buy those cars. People need to be feeling comfortable with support infrastructure, so repair workshops, supplies of spare parts, and all these kinds of things. That takes time to build. But look back in time. If you go back a couple of decades, that is where Japan and Korea was. When I was a kid, Japanese cars were not the kind of cars they are today. People kind of frowned upon them because the quality wasn't actually as great as they were in the by the 1980s. So by the 1980s, Japanese manufacturers had completely reinvented how they work. They had lean manufacturing. They had a supply network that was tightly integrated. The quality actually was world class. And that is what's happening in China too. Chinese manufacturers 20 years ago, let me be frank, these cars were inferior to what you see in other places. That's completely changed. You see, EV revolution, some of these manufacturers, they have learned right from the start to build high quality cars. And so the BYDs that are on the road and the Great Wall Motor cars that are on the road, they have reached a world-class level. They can compete on an equal footing with Western manufacturers. And that's a game changer for the auto industry. And so what do Canadian and American manufacturers need to do to survive? The answer is innovate and catch up. And if they don't do that, if they are protected by a tariff wall, and that one day that tariff wall magically disappears, they will be left to suffer because they haven't innovated. And that happens to all companies that are protected by a high tariff wall. Eventually something's going to give, and these companies are going to lose out because they haven't innovated, and they can't compete anymore. So my strong message to the car manufacturers is don't believe because Mr. Trump is protecting competition right now in the United States that will allow you to keep on selling what you're selling. Because the moment electric vehicles are cheaper and better, and they are better in many ways already. Anyone who drives an EV knows that. That moment will come and it will transform the car industry. The manufacturer in Europe is seeing that light. They're scrambling to invest and build infrastructure to get on top of the technology and develop the next generation of battery technology so they can leapfrog over the lithium iron phosphate into the next generation batteries. That's how you play that game. That's how you survive. Constant innovation and not staying behind the tariff wall.
We're really jumping from the macro to the micro, and we're going down to the micro here. How do you recommend institutions and large employers forecast their future demand for EV chargers for their audience and employees?
Like we're at work.
Charging for a place like UBC, for instance.
Yeah. New or existing? No, this is getting nuanced, but I mean, just on the new side, so all new construction, integrate EV charging, like do it when it's cheapest and at least it's ready, and you don't need to go right to the installation of EV infrastructure, but having the capability. Single family residential as well, by far the cheapest time to put in that 240 volt service is that time of construction. retrofit, or I mean, you're working on this plan here at UBC, right? Looking at it, and I don't, it's a hard thing to answer because if I were, if I didn't have a level 2 charger at home and I was a garage orphan, I didn't have access to, I only had on-street parking. I'd be asking my employer, like, start to electrify and enable at work charging. And I think that is the opportunity in urban centers specifically, where we do have a lot of residents or apartments that are just like, they're not going to be fully electrified for EV charging. So the workplace, I think there's dual opportunity here. So accommodating those that won't have that home charging. But I love some of the innovation that's coming out of use of overnight parking in empty lots. So if you're a school or a church or even like a workplace with a large parking lot that by 5 p.m. is empty, what an opportunity to maximize on low carbon fuel standard, set up overnight charging opportunities for local neighborhood or other use, and get the utilization out of the stations that you need to warrant the cost to begin with, right? So I don't know if that answers it. That's just my ideas. But you're doing it.
A couple of more thoughts on this issue. Work-based EV charging is easier when you have a large number of people parking, because then the overhead cost distributes more equally across more charging opportunities. And so large employers, University of BC, Vancouver General Hospital, and many more that have lots of employees, TransLink, for example, and any place that has the capacity also to manage more charging, will find it easier to do so because the overhead is just that time is more easily. Smaller employers, they don't struggle if they don't have the infrastructure already. But whenever we build new spaces, residential spaces, commercial spaces, we need to make sure they're EV enabled right from the start. So that's the easy frontier, but the retrofitting is always more challenging. We can't just mandate it to everybody who is an employee, because certainly the smaller ones might be too expensive. But the larger ones, I think there are more opportunities. And here we can see and figure out how can we make it the most affordable. Because if we just put in level 3 chargers, they may be very expensive in many instances. But if you know you park there for 6 to 8 hours, well, you can do the math. Now, if you commute to work and per day you drive only maybe 40 kilometers, and how many kilowatt hours do you need? Well, multiply the system 25 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. That's all the average for EVs. And then you know how many kilowatt hours? 8 to 10. And even a level 1 charger will get you charged 8 to 10 kilowatt hours in a time period that work. So we don't have to have the extravagant solution that's really expensive. We need to have a cheap and affordable and convenient solution. And so we really need to figure out what is the right solution for which workplace. And then it's different because you have different types of employees. People come and go because they say a salesperson, they may come into work, pick up stuff when they leave, and so they may be only present for a short period. Whereas an office worker comes to work at 9, leaves at 5, and you're present 8 hours. So we need to figure out which solution fits the right kind of environments, and then see what we can do to retrofit more and more places. But it's a challenge, and again, the low-hanging fruit are probably the large employers.
I think we have time for one last question. No, I'm trying to pick ones that haven't been touched on in some form earlier, but this one, I don't know, it's a bit of a polemical one, so let me go for it. How do the EV incentives compare to oil and gas industry subsidies and tax breaks? So on that note,
The battle of the subsidies. And the fact is, the oil and gas industry has received huge subsidies. In fact, the fact that there's very low taxes on gasoline is actually a subsidy in a very important form, because if you look at all the externalities that come from the use of gasoline, we're not pricing gasoline anywhere at the level it should be in North America. And in the United States, even less so than in Canada. Gas tax are much higher in Europe, much closer to the level that we think actually reflects the negative externalities of using gasoline. So there are subsidies already, plus all kinds of accelerated write-offs, and you actually invest in drilling a hole in the ground. And yeah, so if you tally up those subsidies that the oil and gas industry has been receiving, it's still in the billions of dollars. So they can't complain if the government spent a few $1 billion on subsidies for EVs. I think in a historic comparison, the gas and oil industry is way ahead in terms of getting the subsidy rates.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very obvious. Of course, it's a richer subsidy structure. But I always, this comes up often, just in, community conversations, and that is not well reflected, or what's the word? I think people forget when they're using that argument of why should government funding subsidize this technology, and so gently pointing it out is something that has to happen, like often. but like the gas industry, there and how we characterize today, in terms of the necessary investment to enable transformation that will become a good business case, for private sector to take on themselves. But yeah, there's no way, the communities across Canada that are not, don't have a high density of EV drivers at this point can participate in the transition without some level of support, at least at the outset, right? But that doesn't have to be forever. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for your great responses and for a really illuminating session on EV policy, EV practice in Canada. Thank you.